Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Saturday, the 11th of October, 2025. A little over 5 years ago, I did an interview with David Nasaw, a very distinguished American historian on the million refugees left behind in Germany after World War II. It was an interview about his remarkable book, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. And David is back 5 years later with another magisterial historical work, The Wounded Generation, Coming Home After World War II. And David is joining us from 101st Street and Broadway in New York City. David, congratulations on the new book. It's out on Tuesday.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here.
Did it take you 5 years? I'm assuming a huge amount of work on this.
Yeah, it takes a long time. Part of it, the difficulty was that I did this work through COVID, and that required less travel, but a lot of preliminary work to find archives online and then arrange to have material sent to me. And I always take a long time to research and write. I don't remember a lot. My mind is fuzzy. So I've got to research and then write chapter by chapter and then go back and put it all together and establish the threads in the narrative.
I'm curious that such a distinguished historian as you acknowledges that they have a fuzzy memory. Maybe the fuzzier the memory, the better the historian. When, of course, people will hear the title of your new book, The Wounded Generation, Coming Home After World War II, they will automatically think of another title of another book, another very influential book, Tom Brokaw's 1998 book, The Greatest Generation, about the generation that came home from war. I'm assuming, David, that if not a polemical quality, certainly The Wounded Generation is a reference to The Greatest Generation. Is that fair?
Yeah, it certainly is. Look, Tom Brokaw was important because he placed a focus on the World War II veterans up until Reagan visited D-Day and gave a remarkable speech written by Peggy Noonan. The World War II veterans had been cast aside. Nobody talked about them. And in large part because they didn't talk about themselves. One of the things I learned in doing the research for this book was that the World War II veterans on returning home had little to say to family, friends, reporters about their experience during the war and after the war. They had become a forgotten generation of soldiers, of servicemen, until Reagan visited Normandy with a full contingent of press, followed by Tom Brokaw's books. Now, those books are important, and Reagan's speech was important, but it focused entirely on the heroism of the servicemen who fought and won World War II. And it did not pay attention to their homecoming. It did not pay attention to the lives they led, the difficulties they had in the transition from war to peace, from soldier to civilian. So in effect, my book begins where his book left off. And I focus not on the heroism, though they certainly were heroes, but on what happens when they return, on PTSD, which was undiagnosed and untreated, on alcoholism, which was the only way to treat undiagnosed and untreated PTSD, on marriages that could not be put back together again. There were more divorces in 1946 than there had ever been before or since. On racial animosities, there were more lynchings in 1946 than there had been before that. On the difficulties these guys had living normal lives. As a historian, I try to put things in context. And one of the things we forget, Brokaw spent a little bit of time on it, is that these men had gone away to war having grown up in a decade of depression. 1939, 1940, unemployment rates were still above 20%. So when they returned, large numbers of them, a majority of them, feared that they would never get jobs, that the country would be embroiled once again in depression. And, this was a major worry. How do you begin your life again if you can't get a job? And how do you begin your life if there's no house to live in for you, or apartment or dwelling for you and your family? The worst housing crisis this country has ever seen was the one after World War II. And why? Because no homes were built during the Depression years or during World War II. And there were other shortages as well. The veterans were not the only ones who were afraid. The home front, their wives, their loved ones, their friends, their parents, their siblings greeted them with elation that they had survived in one piece, but fear that they would not be the same. And they weren't the same.
Yes, and incredible. And all this is particularly depressing given that these were supposed to be the victors. God knows what it was like for, and I'm sure books have been written. Maybe you will write one day about soldiers coming home from the Eastern Front in Germany or something, or Italians, or of course the Japanese. Was there a big difference, speaking of the Asian front versus the European front, David, between the generation coming back from Europe and those coming back from the Far East?
There were different degrees of pain and suffering on both sides. This was a dreadful war, just a dreadful war. When you compare it, and we don't, I don't know that we get it. It was the longest war. Americans fought in this war for a longer period, more Americans for a longer period of time than any war before. In World War I, the average duration in uniform was less than a year. In World War II, it was almost 3 years. In World War I, about half of the draftees went abroad. In World War II, it was 3/4. In World War I, less than 6 months. The American troops spent less than 6 months in Europe. In World War II, the average time overseas was a year and a half, and for many, much longer than that. The difficulties, the soldiers in the Pacific suffered. They suffered from a variety of tropical diseases, which they brought home with them. They suffered from this sense that the Japanese were ruthless animals who didn't obey the rules of war. They suffered from being shipped from island to island they suffered from a lack of support and lack of replacements and difficulties in communicating with home. And I think they suffered from poor leadership. On the European front, they suffered because of almost endless combat. The GIs and the Marines and the airmen, they went from North Africa to Sicily to Italy. It was supposed to be a brief time in Italy. It took a year to get to Rome. Those who crossed the Channel on D-Day, everyone expected the war would soon be over after the successful landing. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't. Paris was easily taken, but the attempt to move, the invasion of Germany took forever. And the casualties in the last year of the war in Europe were greater than in any other year. The other thing that we forget is that there was a shortage of replacements, especially on the European front in the last year. And why? Because on the home front, we were, as a nation, in our war, munitions, aviation, tank, shipbuilding factories, we were equipping not only the American Army, but the Soviet Army and the British Army as well. So we couldn't take all the able-bodied men that were needed to fight the war. And as a result, in the Battle of the Bulge, in the move through Germany, GIs were in combat on the front line for day after day, week after week, month after month, far longer than they would ever be again in any combat zone.
What are the numbers? I know that the numbers of the 16 million who went to war, 670,000 servicemen and women, 565 in the army alone. Is that accurate? I know that was one of the numbers put in a review.
Yeah, well, those are the wounded. Those are the wounded, and the wounded were extraordinary. Again, much, much less than the Germans or the Soviets. But an extraordinary number. The deaths were over 400,000. And again, that was much less than our adversaries or our allies. Medical science, military medical science, had improved to the point where Marines and GIs and airmen who would have died in World War I survived.
David, I mean, I'm not sure whether these comparisons are appropriate, but given that the experience for Europeans in World War I was so much, I mean, I don't know if it was more horrendous, certainly equally horrendous, did that make the American experience in World War II, given that they entered the First World War relatively late and the numbers were much smaller, did that make this wounded generation and this experience more dramatic?
Yes, I think it certainly did. It certainly did. You know, President Roosevelt and the War Department had a very difficult balancing act. They wanted Americans to know that we would win this war eventually, but they didn't want Americans to get impatient or say, bring the troops home, let's have a negotiated peace. So over a period of time, as the war ground on, and as that peace, that unconditional surrender that Roosevelt and Churchill demanded, didn't come about, it was necessary to bring to the home front the stories, the horrendous stories of what was going on in the trenches in Europe and what was going on in the Pacific. So the drama, the sense that, wow, we would just sweep everybody away. Certainly after the first couple, I mean, we suffered defeats immediately from Pearl Harbor for the next, period of months. But the American people and the soldiers expected that the war would be over sooner than it was. And the heartbreak at home and abroad when that didn't happen was something that hadn't occurred in World War One.
We also did a show a few years ago with Matthew Delmont. I'm sure you're familiar with his book, Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. How did the experience of African Americans fighting in the Second World War, how did it differ from the experience of white Americans?
It was extraordinarily different. I think under 10% of the armed forces were African Americans. They were barred from combat until the very end, They were barred from combat because it was the War Department's sense, Secretary Stimson's sense, Secretary of the Navy Knox's sense that African Americans wouldn't be good soldiers. So they, instead of being on the front
Sorry
line,
to jump in here, David. Good meaning brave or loyal? Or efficient?
Brave, all of the above. Effective was the term that was used.
Quite a euphemism, right?
Yeah. So the African American soldiers, without them, the war could not have been won. They built the bridges. They unloaded the cargo. They fed and cared for the troops. They were the medics. They cleaned up the bodies. They took care of the wounded. They transported munitions and soldiers back and forth. They cooked and fed and cleaned up for the combat soldiers. And at the end, they fought. And they fought dramatically, and they fought well. When they came home, I've got a photograph from Life magazine, extraordinary photograph, that was published in June of 1944, I believe. And it was after the liberation of France, maybe later than that, after the liberation of France. And in Life magazine, there's a full page photograph of a Black soldier dancing with a white woman. In the South, politicians, civilians, police forces understood that the African American who had worked on the farm as a sharecropper or done some sort of menial work, when he went abroad, wearing the uniform of his country and living among people who did not practice Jim Crow, who did not believe in white supremacy, when those African Americans came back, they were going to demand changes. So the white South prepared preemptively, and they prepared to meet any attempts at upsetting Jim Crow or of soldiers, veterans registering to vote or sitting in the front of the bus or not getting off the sidewalks. They were prepared to meet that with violence, and they did meet that with violence. When the GI Bill was written and passed in June of 1944, in order to get the support of Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans for what looked like an extension of the New Deal, using federal money to give to individuals, the only way to get the support of the Southerners and the Midwestern Republicans was to guarantee that local officials and authorities would decide who was going to get the money. The federal government would dispense the money through the VA, but it was local officials who would decide who'd get it. So in my book, again, focusing on the post-war period, I look at what happened to the Black GIs who came back. The GI Bill offered free tuition, free college tuition. But in the South, state colleges and universities were segregated by law. And the historically Black colleges in the South were already oversubscribed. They couldn't give places to the Black veterans. If you didn't get into college or university, you weren't going to be able to, take advantage of free tuition and living expenses. There was special unemployment insurance through the GI that white veterans used, but the Black veterans were told, go back to you can take your old job as a sharecropper. And if you don't take it, you're not going to get unemployment insurance.
I know one of the characters one of the distinguished Americans you cover in the book is Harry Belafonte. Tell us his story, how he both conforms to your narrative and perhaps in a way was exceptional.
Yeah, Harry Belafonte was in the Navy, and he came home from the war, and the only work he could find was as a janitor's assistant.
And this is a Black man, right? From where?
This is a Black man, yes. This is a man from the Caribbean. He comes back, and the only job he can find again is as a janitor's assistant. He helps someone in the building. I don't remember exactly what he does. And as a tip, she gives him tickets to the theater. He goes to the theater for the first time ever and is just amazed. He looks around and she tells him, well, why don't you try to get lessons, go to the drama guild, go here, go there. And he used his GI veterans benefits because he's in the North and in New York City to study acting and creates a career for himself. And he wasn't the only one. John Coltrane uses his veterans benefits to improve on his jazz improvisation and composition. Tito Puente uses the GI benefits to go to Juilliard, okay? But these were the exceptions. These were Northerners who didn't go to colleges. They went to vocational schools through the GI Bill.
You feature some writers as well. I mean, people who came back, not perhaps with not with PSSD, but rather perhaps with ideas about the war, which they put pen to paper. Salinger, of course, Kurt Vonnegut, and also Joseph Heller, who in my view wrote the greatest of all the World War II masterpieces, Catch-22. What did Salinger and Vonnegut and Heller have in common, if anything?
They had in common, they had never in their wildest imaginations, when they were in high school and as young adults, imagined that they were going to go off to war. Never. But when the time came and they were drafted, there they were. Salinger is an interesting case. My God, if you've read his short stories when he comes home, including A Fine Day for Banana Fish and a bunch of others in which he talks about the war, it's remarkable, incredible. A Perfect Day for Banana Fish is the name of the short story. Salinger came home and his daughter believes, and others believe, he had PTSD. He never talked about the war, his experiences in the war. He used his fictional characters in his short stories to talk about the terror, to talk about the trauma. In Perfect Day for Banana Fish, his stand-in commits suicide.
Is that a feature, David, of PTSD, of not being able to talk about the war? Sometimes it's presented perhaps by people like Brokaw as some sort of heroism, but maybe it's almost like a psychotic condition. Having experienced this nightmare, you simply weren't able to talk about it.
Exactly. The men who came back with PTSD,
And these
Vonnegut,
are millions. I mean,
millions. Vonnegut may have as well. Heller claimed that he didn't, but I don't know. They came back, and Vonnegut writes this extraordinary book when he comes back.
Slaughterhouse-Five.
Slaughterhouse-Five, yeah.
Which is, yeah, I mean, that's also, I mean, to compare Slaughterhouse-Five and Catch-22 is probably not particularly helpful, but it's an entirely remarkable book, isn't it?
Isn't it? It's extraordinary. And in it, he talks about time travel. Well, time travel is something that PTSD, it's not called time travel. It means that you can't live in the present, that you're continually in nightmares and flashbacks going back to your experience. That's what trauma is, post-traumatic. You had the trauma in the source of the trauma in the war, and you live with it for the rest of your life. And the only way to get over it is to distract yourself from the war, to stop thinking about the war, to stop talking about the war, to never look at a film about the war, to lock yourself inside on July 4th so you don't hear the fireworks going off. So none of these guys write memoirs about their experience in the war until much later. Heller sort of does, but he makes light of it. He jokes.
Right. And the humor of Catch-22 is, I guess it's Central European. There's a kind of Kafka-esque quality to Catch-22, which is particularly memorable, isn't it? This attack on military bureaucracy.
Yeah. It's these are remarkable books. There are any number of poets who come back and they talk about what goes on. You know, in the post-war period, the number of veterans who try to come to terms with their experience is remarkable. Jimmy Stewart was.
Yeah, I was thinking of Jimmy Stewart because he made a career after the war as being the most everyman of Americans, and I'm assuming that was a piece of what he brought back from the war as this kind of ironic quality.
Absolutely, but you know, when he came back from the war, every producer in Hollywood wanted him to star in the Jimmy Stewart story and to talk about his experience in the Air Force, and he wouldn't do it. He refused. William Wyler, the great director who lost his hearing, he went on a bombing mission and came back and couldn't hear at all in one ear, thought his career was over. He made, I think, one of the greatest of all films, and certainly the greatest post-World War II movie, Best Years of Our Lives. And he recaptured, or he transmitted the traumas of war into art and did so brilliantly. It's a film worth watching over and over again. And it's true to life because Wyler lived it. And he knew what he was talking about.
Jimmy Stewart was, I think, a conservative. I can't remember if he was close to Reagan or to Nixon. Did these men, and I know it's hard to generalize, but given the Cold War erupting immediately after the Second World War, given, I guess, what some, certainly on the European front, had experienced of the Soviets, did they bring back an anti-communism? Was that one of the features of of coming home? I mean, some of them must have, at least before going, must have been isolationist. Did they come back more as internationalists? I mean, obviously people like Vonnegut and Heller were ambivalent at best about the idea of war.
They, what's interesting, what was interesting to me was, we historians, I blame my cult for this. We have forgotten or don't write about the period from 1945 to 1950. We go right from the war to the Cold War. Now, the Cold War is brewing all through the 40s. But it doesn't really take off until Korea, which is, 5 years after World War II. These guys came back, and for a period of time, those who had fought on the European front came back with no ill notions or dark thoughts about the Soviets, because they knew what the Soviet soldiers had gone through and that they had helped to win the war. It was only later that they began to shift and to change their minds. But most of them came back and they were concerned with the everyday lives of veterans and Americans. Joe McCarthy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jack Kennedy, Bob Dole. These were only some of the veterans who came back.
Kissinger as well.
Kissinger, absolutely.
Before we get to I want to come to the politicians in a second. But what about the experience of those Americans who had liberated the concentration camps? Did they come home particularly wounded? What do you write about those American soldiers
there are two groups of soldiers and airmen who suffered the most. Those were the prisoners of war. There are about 130,000 of them. And those in the Pacific suffered incomparably more than those in Germany. And the second group is those who liberated the camps or visited the camps afterwards. Eisenhower, to show the servicemen before the VE Day in May and after VE Day, made a point of bringing as many soldiers as he could to see the camps. So it was not simply those who had been there in the early days and liberated the camps. It was, lots of soldiers on the European front visited the camps, and they never forgot it. They never got over it. Whether they were Jewish or whatever their religion, or not Jewish, the horror stayed with them. And the horror of those in the concentration camps, the incidents of PTSD and alcoholism and suicide among those who were in the POW camps was incredible. Kurt Vonnegut, his sense of, I don't know what we call it, of dark whimsy. He was quickly taken prisoner in the Battle of the Bulge, I think it was, and spent most of the war or his time in Europe in a prisoner camp in Dresden, where part of his job was to bury civilians and German soldiers after the Allied bombings of Dresden.
And Slaughterhouse 5 is about the bombing.
Yeah. Now, how do you get over that? How do you do one of two things? If you're an artist, you can write about it. If you're not an artist, you do your best to forget about it and not to talk about it. My father was a medical officer. He was a lawyer by trade, but they didn't know what to do with him because he couldn't type. So they made him a medical officer, and he ran a hospital in Eritrea. And something happened. I don't know what, because he wouldn't talk about it. And when I asked questions, it was clear he didn't want to talk about it. All I know is he came home with a heart condition, an alcoholic, addicted to cigarettes. He eventually rather quickly got off the booze because my mother said she was leaving and taking us with her if he didn't stop drinking. But he never stopped smoking. And the GIs, 68 billion cigarettes were distributed to the men overseas in 1944, and 114 billion were in the pipeline for 1945. So scores of veterans came back.
There's a book, yeah. There's a book in that. And what about the men who came back from particularly from the Asian front, in their response to the dropping of the nuclear weapons? Were they pretty sympathetic to the decision? Were they ambivalent?
No, they were delighted. They were delighted. I mean, if you polled all the soldiers and everybody in the military, they applauded the end of the war. All the soldiers who had been on the European front, 90% of them were brought back to the United States, but not for good. They were on their way to Japan. They were given a month off. They came back to the United States, trained, and they were going to go to Japan. And the exhilaration when the war was over. For those in the Pacific, it was the same. Nobody wanted to invade Japan. And it was assumed that the only way to end the war was an invasion. Years later, some would change their minds, but at the time, there was almost universal applause for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the end of the war.
You talked about some politicians, Nixon, JFK, Bob Dole. Is JFK's experience unusual? I mean, it's glamorous. I think it was made into a Hollywood movie. It made his reputation. He certainly was a remarkable hero. Do you think he came back wounded mentally from the war?
I think he came back wounded mentally and physically.
I mean, he was clearly physically.
He came back from the war and he didn't quite know what to do with himself. And eventually he ran for office, in part because his older brother, who was going to be the first Catholic president, had died in battle. Joe Kennedy Jr. had been in a plane that was loaded with explosives and took off from England, and he was supposed to parachute out of the plane after directing it into
it was
a
about
German
as close
site.
to a suicide mission as you can get.
Oh, God. So Jack finally decided, well, why not? My grandfather was a congressman. My father was, wanted to run for office but couldn't for a bunch of reasons. I'm going to run for office. And he was a terrible congressman. I mean, he did very little, with the exception of lobbying, speaking out for veterans and veterans housing. He devoted himself to getting housing subsidies to build houses. The GI Bill guaranteed mortgages, but you had to get a mortgage, buy a house, and there simply was such a shortage. And Kennedy fought like hell to get those subsidies and houses built for the veterans. He was joined in that by Javits, a Republican Jew, the Republican Jew and the Democratic Catholic, banded together to fight, for veterans housing. They were both veterans.
Can one make generalizations about politically such disparate characters as JFK, Bob Dole, Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon? Were they somehow tied together, David, as veterans?
No. When the war was over, there was much fear and among the political classes that the veterans were going to vote as a bloc, and they were either going to take the country to the far left or the far right. And the established political parties didn't know what to do. They also knew that they needed veterans to run for office. They recruited Nixon. Nixon had no idea going into politics. But he was a handsome guy. He was a Navy veteran. They grabbed him, brought him back to California to run for office. But the veterans' vote never materialized. Republican veterans voted Republican. Democratic veterans voted Democratic. The only unifying theme here was housing. Nixon sort of kept quiet about it. Gerald Ford was in favor of it. The only veteran who was against special government subsidies for housing was Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy said, "Let the private sector build houses. We don't need any government interference." Boy, was he wrong.
Yeah, I'm thinking out loud. I mean, who was the first American president? Was it? It must have been was LBJ? He wasn't on the front.
No, but LBJ.
He was the first.
There's great debate about whether he was ever in danger. He was part of the effort. He went.
Why wasn't he?
He joined, and he went on bombing missions for a brief period of time, and then President Roosevelt called back all of the congressmen and senators who had joined the armed forces and said, you got one choice or another. You can't hold your seat and go off to war. So Johnson was very happy to come back. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. And a bunch of others resigned their seats in Congress and the Senate to fight in the war. And they did that as patriotic Americans, but also because they knew that it was going to be much easier to get reelected if they could say, "I spent the war years in uniform."
Yeah,
Johnson was able to say that.
Yeah, again, thinking out loud. I mean, obviously there's Carter, but Reagan represents a break in the sense that he wasn't in the war, but he was a Hollywood actor who I'm sure in movies where he appeared to be in the war.
Yeah, he appeared to be in the war. And, Jimmy Stewart later became friendly with him. Jimmy Stewart and Henry Fonda.
Stewart was close to Reagan.
Yeah, when the war was over, Jimmy Stewart and Henry Fonda, who had both been in the war and in battle, came back, and Jimmy Stewart moved into the kids' house where Jane Fonda and Peter Fonda had lived. And he stayed there for about 6 months. And Fonda and Jimmy Stewart spent their time making model airplanes and flying them to get over the shock of war. They were scared to death that people like Reagan and Dana Andrews, and there were a bunch of others, were going to take over their leading men roles, and they weren't happy about it. Stewart later changed his mind about Reagan.
Finally, David, so it was a wonderful conversation, and you're a remarkable biographer of this generation. What would you like your book to teach Gen Zers? They talk about being the anxious generation. The idea of being wounded now amongst many Gen Zers is taken in psychological terms, in terms of how their parents treat them, how society has treated them. Would you like your book to be a kind of wake-up call, or in a sense, are you suggesting that every generation is wounded one way or the other?
It may be true that every generation is wounded one way or another, but not the way this generation was wounded. And what I would like it to take away is the same message from the last million. And that is that wars do not end with peace treaties. Wars do not end when the soldiers come home. And when we look at wars, when we look at conflicts, when we look at battles, whether they're in Gaza or in the Ukraine or in Africa, we've got to understand the harm, the lasting harm that is done to generations of soldiers and generations of civilians. And that's a lesson that we have to learn.
Well, it's a fascinating conversation. Remarkable book, remarkable historian. It's out on Tuesday. The Wounded Generation, Coming Home After World War II. You're working on another project, David? You got another book in you?
No, I'm going to take time off or retire from writing. It's hard work.
It's wounding, is it?
It is wounding, yes. Maybe heroic as well, but wounding is the adjective that I will live with.